My name is Rose Kaplan-Bomberg. I'm a Success Engineer at CircleCI. Today we'll be talking about Workflows 101, running jobs on CircleCI 2.0. So today I'm going to be talking about why we built workflows, be going through job orchestration, and talking about filters, contexts, and workspaces, and more. And then finally, I'll be going through how you can use workflows and go over some examples as well. So just before we get started, some key terms. So when I talk about a workflow, I'm talking about a set of rules in your config file that define how a number of jobs, for example, build, test, and deploy are run, giving teams granular control over their software development process. So a job would just be a collection of steps, commands, tests, caching, things like that. And you would typically have multiple jobs in a workflow. And then a single step just refers to any little specific bit of config syntax, say running, checking out your code from GitHub, etc. So why we built workflows? So every team's build, test, and deploy pipeline is different. So CircleCI 1.0 was designed to be a simple one-size-fits-all solution, build, test, and then deploy. But in the real world, we know that everyone's process is different. And with workflows, we give teams the ability to mirror their ideal process and the configuration of their jobs so that how your changes move from commit to testing to staging to deploy is fully in your control. About that. Okay. So speed. One of the major features of workflows is additional build speed. You can run your jobs in parallel. So on CircleCI 1.0, steps always ran sequentially, but many of them probably didn't need to. So with workflows, you can break your build, test, and deploy pipeline into multiple jobs and run as many in parallel as you like. And that's what we call fan out and then fan in. I'll be going over that later on. Additionally, when your jobs fail, you can rerun only those that failed instead of your entire build pipeline. That also saves you time. And the end result is that your code gets to deploy faster. So another major feature would be modularity. You can give each job exactly the platform and exactly the resources that it needs. So on CircleCI 1.0, every job got a monolithic build container with set RAM and CPU. And it's actually pretty interesting. I can show you for a second. So here's everything that was installed in our 1.0 Ubuntu 12.04 precise build image. So as you can see, this is a huge page filled with frameworks and languages, different versions of every single language and framework you can imagine. And that was basically designed to cover, the vast majority of possible build environments and code scenarios. But on CircleCI 2.0 with workflows, we really wanted to break all those things apart and let you decide what your projects need. So we offer configurable resources so that jobs that need less RAM and CPU, you can give them less RAM and CPU, which will be cheaper for you. And if you have jobs that need more, you can give them more. And finally, you can also run multiple jobs in different build environments. So not just different Docker images, which can have any language or framework that you put into it, but also different executors. So you can run with a Mac OS executor, you can run with Docker, or you can run with our machine executor, which is a more 1.0 style VM with a bunch of different things installed into it. And finally, control. Workflows has a number of advanced features designed to give you more power. We've built all our newest features on top of workflows. including things like manual job approval, scheduled workflows, as well as things like contexts, which allow you to share environment variables with your entire organization, and workspaces, which allows you to pass data from one workflow job to another. And finally, manual gating. If you want to set up a manual approval step before your deployment jobs, for example, that's something you can do on 2.0 with workflows. So with that, let's get into some examples. So I'm going to start with job orchestration, and we'll start with sequential jobs. So here's just a quick little diagram. So sequential jobs is probably the pipeline that you're most familiar with. It most resembles how you would build projects on 1.0. You have build, test, and deploy running in order, and our analogy, listening to a playlist. And for an example of that, head over to my server installation. And here's a pretty simple example of a fairly sequential workflow. So we have a node job. We have a manual approval job here. We have iOS and Android jobs here. And then finally, we have a deploy manual approval step, and then a final deployment job. So parallel jobs or build matrices. This allows you to run a bunch of jobs at once. So there's a couple different reasons that you would want to do this. So here's one really interesting example. So this job is nothing more than running the same code against 3 different versions of Ruby. So that's a pretty common scenario. And it's kind of the one represented by the example here, where you would be testing car tires against various models of car. But you can also do this with test suites, for example. So if you have multiple test suites that you might want to run, you can run them at the same time. They might not necessarily depend on each other, so you can just get them all done at the same time. So restarting from a failed job. So once you break your build, test, deploy pipeline into multiple jobs, it means that when something goes wrong, you don't have to rerun all of it. You can just rerun the things that failed. So restarting from a save point in a video game. And we can look at an example here. So I set up this workflow to fail intentionally. And you can see here that we can choose to rerun the workflow from the beginning, or we can rerun just the failed jobs. And what's going to happen here is that it will rerun just the iOS and Android jobs. So fan in, fan out. So this is really kind of the prototypical workflow scenario. So you probably start with one job where you're checking out your code, pulling in some assets, running some basic linting and things like that. Then you go on to a bunch of different test jobs that you can all run in parallel. And then finally, you would have a single deployment job. So going back to our React Native demo project, you can see here that the fanning out step happens here when we run our iOS and Android jobs at the same time. And then we fan back in to our deploy steps. And we can see another example of that here. Where we have a checkout code job, we bundle our dependencies, then we precompile some assets and run some rake tests at the same time. And then finally, we do our deployment here. So the next big feature of workflows would be modularity. So let's talk about jobs with different resource class settings. So what does this look like? So this is our reality check project. This is designed to test the major features of a CircleCI installation that's hosted yourself. And if we look into our resource class jobs workflow, we can see here, we have 5 different jobs that ran in parallel, and these are all running with different resources. So from small all the way up to X large. And to see what that looks like in config, it's as simple as setting this key, resource class. And as you can see in the comments here, each resource class indicates that you get different CPUs and different RAM. Okay, so let me read over this question real quick. So it's a question about migrating from 1.0 to 2.0. So the best documentation for migrating to 2.0 So I would recommend reading through our Getting Started doc, which will really kind of explain the differences between 1 and 2.0. So Zach Mason mentioned our 1 to 2.0 config translator. And the config translator is really designed to kind of give you a bare bones skeleton of a 2.0 configuration file. It's not designed to take your 1.0 project and get it ready for production in 2.0. It's just designed to kind of help get the ball rolling for you. The best way, I would say, is really to learn about 2.0 and then just start writing your config. And with workflows, it's really helpful because you can see precisely where each bit of your code failed, and that will help you iteratively build your config file. And with EOL coming up, we're very aware that there's a big time crunch for a lot of folks who are trying to migrate their projects over. And on the customer engineering team, we're very happy to help folks out who need any assistance migrating projects to 2.0, because we have done it many, many times. In regards to resource class, what configuration was set as the default in 1.0? That's a great question. I guess the question would be, what was the default RAM CPU on 1.0? And I am not actually sure if I know. Let's see. It should be pretty easy for us to find out, though. Do you include RAM CPU info here? I'm not actually sure. I can tell you that on 2.0, though, if you don't specify any resource class, you're going to get this default: 2 vCPUs and 4 gigabytes of RAM. And then from there, you can scale down or you can scale up. But I can actually look into what the resource settings were on 1.0, because I don't know that off the top of my head. Let me just take a note of that. Whoops. So just talking about resource class for one more second. So the use case would probably be, once you break your workflow up into a bunch of different jobs, some of those jobs like checkout, linting, uploading artifacts, deployment steps, those are really tiny, so you can give them less RAM and CPU. And then for your larger jobs where you're building and compiling assets, running test suites, doing a lot of database reading and writing, you would probably want to give those more RAM and CPU. Okay, And Zach, yeah, I would definitely recommend contacting us. I totally recognize that trying to migrate other people's code is really challenging. That's a lot of what we do in the customer engineering team every day. And it's a kind of a fun project to try to write a config file for somebody's source code that you haven't actually looked through a ton. But we can definitely help you out with that. And I'll be sharing my email address at the end of this webinar, so feel free to reach out to me with specific questions. Any timeline for when 2.0 workflows will be able to be triggered by calls to the CircleCI API or ran locally? Very soon. That is coming this summer for sure. That's one of our top requested features. I know that I'm looking forward to it as well. So how to specify the size of machine needed. So I was just talking about this a minute ago. If you look over here, this is our configuration reference. There's a resource class key, which you can put in your config.yaml, and that will tell our build runner how large of a container to allocate for your build. Okay, so there's a question about Git tagging. So I will get to that shortly when I get into Git branch and tag filters. It's a great question. So just to finish up on this modularity section, in addition to specifying resources, you can also run your jobs in different build environments. So this is one of the huge features of 2.0 and workflows. In 1.0, you had a single build environment. I mean, you could choose between, Ubuntu 12.04 and Ubuntu 14.04, but that's not much of a choice compared to the wealth of options you have on 2.0, where you can run builds in any Docker image. You can run using our machine executor, which is a VM designed to give you access to full operating system resources. And you can also run iOS builds using our macOS executor. And because you have access to any Docker image, you can essentially run your job using any language or framework that you could put into a Docker image. And we go a step further by providing a series of convenience Docker images that we recommend customers use that just cover a lot of common languages and frameworks and databases. So Postgres, Node, Ruby, MySQL, etc. Okay, so a question about covering CircleCI support for Docker image building. I will definitely talk about that. And support for Windows builds, that is in the pipeline for 2018. It's going to come after a couple of other things like API support for workflows and EOL for 1.0, but it's definitely a highly requested feature, and it's coming soon. Docker image building, I will go over later. It's not something I was going to specifically cover in this webinar, so I might try to address it at the end if I can. And if not, feel free to email me at the end, because it's a very common CircleCI use case. So going on to control, so let's talk about Git, branch, and tag filters. So Workflows really gives you a lot of options for doing control flow in your config. And one of the simplest ways you can do that is by using Git branch and tag filters. So we can take a look at an example here. Oh, and my colleague Matt is reminding me that our next webinar, which will be at the end of May, is actually specifically going to cover getting started with Docker images and how you can make the most of building Docker images with workflows on CircleCI 2.0. So for the anonymous attendee who asked that question, definitely come back at the end of May for that webinar. If I don't get a chance to go over it in a ton of depth today, you can learn more about that at our second webinar. So going back to Git branch and tag filters. So this is a special branch I set up with this project called Workflow Can't Finish. So why can't the workflow finish? Well, if we go into our config, you can see that I added this job here, a test gate. So this is an approval type job, which I'll talk about in a second. But the really important thing here is you see this filters bit syntax. So this is only going to run on the Workflows webinar branch, which is not the branch that we're on. You can see the branch we're on up here. So what that means is that all these later jobs, which all require this test gate job, none of them are going to be able to run. And that's why if we click into this workflow, you'll see that it only has a single job. Whereas if we go back to one of these other ones, you can see the full set of jobs. And I don't have a git tag example set up, but it's really the same. I can just pull up the docs real quick. So similar to how you would have this filters branches syntax, you would just add a subkey for tags as well. And as it says here, it can either be a whitelisting or it can be an ignoring. And as you see here, you can also use regexes or regexes. This is the first time I've said that out loud in front of a ton of people, so I'm not sure how people usually say it, but yeah, so you have a lot of options for doing control flow with your workflow jobs. Now let's just do some housekeeping real quick, close a couple of these. So going back to control, will it be fixed soon? So is that question about just the workflows outage that's happening right now? And then another question, using tag wasn't showing on workflow. Okay, so this is linked to a question in our community forums. So I will bookmark this and take a look at it afterwards. And if you follow up with me over email, I can respond to you there, or I can just have somebody respond to this discuss thread. Okay, so the next feature in control would be scheduled workflows. So this is really useful for doing things like running nightly builds. And let me pull up my example. Let's see. I think I pushed one of these last night and kind of guessed at what time I would be getting to this feature in my webinar. So let's see, I set it to run on a cron at 22:26 UTC. Right now we are at 18:28. Okay, I must have gotten the UTC conversion wrong. So let me just push a commit real quick. I'm going to push it for like 5 minutes in the future, and we can watch one of those jobs run. So a little bit of live coding. Set up a new schedule branch. And let's go into our config. So I nicely gave myself this little help here. Oh, okay, right. So this is the cron schedule that I was going to use. So I was guessing 1840. So that's 10 minutes from now. Let me just bump that up so it runs a little faster. So this should run in about 5 minutes. It's set to only run on the Workflows webinar branch. So let me change that because we're not on that branch. So now if we go to this project, you won't even see the commit that I pushed because it's not going to show up until we hit that 2:35 EST or 18:35 UTC cron schedule, which will be pretty cool. So can go talk about something else for 5 minutes. Would be awesome to see some talk around how split by timings works. Documentation is a bit mysterious as to what specifically the split by timing logic is doing in the background. That's a great question. We have been working to revamp that documentation for a while. Test splitting is really powerful, but it's definitely an issue that folks ask us about a lot. I think that would be a great topic for us to cover in another webinar. I can make a note of that. I'm pretty familiar with how test splitting works under the hood. So if you have any specific questions, you can follow up with me over email and I'm happy to answer them, especially if you include like links to a build, things like that. So our last bit of control features, holding jobs for manual approval. So like cron scheduling, this is just another way you can control how and when your jobs run. And we can pull up an example here. So let's rerun this whole workflow so we can see what it looks like. So this no job is pretty quick, so we won't have to wait too long because I set the gate up right at the beginning here. So you'll see here, our job is on hold. If we click on this test gate, we get this approve job window that comes up. So I'm just going to click approve. And now you'll see that the rest of the workflow is running. And you can see that this iOS job failed immediately. The reason that failed immediately is because of our workflows incident, I'm running on my hosted installation here. And our macOS Executor is a cloud-only feature currently, but we're working on rolling out macOS support for hosted installations soon as well. All right, so 2 more minutes till our cron scheduler job runs. So let's move on and talk about advanced features. How does the consolidated run report look like when things finish in parallel? Is it just the graph? Kristen, could you follow up on that question? I'm not totally sure what you're asking about, but I'm happy to answer it for you. And let me just start talking about context in the meantime. So contexts are a feature that is designed to allow you to share resources and secrets like environment variables between not just different branches of a project, but different projects across your organization. And now that you can create multiple contexts, the idea is that you'll be able to restrict one or the other context to various permission groups and things like that. Can you show the UI report of a finished parallel workflow? The UI report of a finished parallel workflow. Oh, 1 second, our cron job is about to run. So let me just want to make sure that we can see that happen. And in the meantime, I can probably find a finished UI of a finished parallel workflow. So let's look at this one, for example. So is that what you're talking about? So here's our 5 jobs that ran in parallel. So that is how that looks. Oh, I think I might have accidentally just answered a question. Oh, okay, Matt handled that one. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, so this is what it looks like when a bunch of parallel jobs finish, essentially. And if you have any other questions about that, feel free to post them. I can follow up. Let's see if our cron job ran like it should have. There it is. So our scheduled job is here. It's on hold because it still has that approval step. If we get into this job here, there's no commit. And the reason there's no commit is because it wasn't triggered by a commit. It was triggered by our schedule that we added. So cron is a pretty widely used scheduling format, I guess, and it really gives you a lot of control. You could run builds every minute, you could run builds every hour, you could run builds every day, every week, etc. So someone is asking, what is the best way of persisting application code between jobs and workspaces? So that's a great question. I'm going to get to workspaces shortly, so I can talk about that. Workspaces can be a little tricky. And there's also some tricky differences. Let me pull up this blog post real quick. Let's see. There it is. So I will talk about this blog post in a second, because Workspaces is similar to things like caching, right? It's just like a different way of doing caching, essentially. And so it can be confusing to figure out when to cache, when to use a workspace. So I can talk about all that. Getting back to context real quick. So if we look in our features jobs here, we can look at the jobs we have that are testing contexts. So the context syntax shows up down here in the workflows config, the workflows part of the config. And you'll see here that this context job is attaching a context called org global. And then this other context job called multi-contexts is attaching a context called individual local. So what does that mean? That means that if we go in here, you'll see that we have those 2 different contexts that were created. And each context stores different resources. Currently, those are just environment variables, but that's going to be added to include other types of resources and secrets that you might want to store. And that gives you really granular control over what jobs have access to what collections of secret keys and environment variables and things like that. And those are all secured with HashiCorp's Vault under the hood. So they're encrypted and protected. And just to be really clear, the person who runs the workflow for context must be a member of the organization for which the context is set. So that's how we handle those permissions issues, to make sure that no one who's unauthorized to access that context is able to use it. So moving on to workspaces. So like I said before, workspaces are just another way of essentially transferring data between different jobs. So if we look in our features job, we have one job here where we write to the workspace and one where we read from the workspace. So let's take a look at what that looks like under the hood. So our read workspace job requires our write workspace job. That's, a basic but important thing to note. Whenever you're trying to attach a workspace, you got to make sure that it was created in an earlier job, otherwise it won't exist. So this is just a really simple example. So we're echoing the number 5 into this file, and then we're saving that directory to a workspace. And then here we attach it, and we look for that value, and it's there. And I had another example set up to show you for that as well. So this gets into kind of all the different things that you can use workspaces for. Can you have repo status badges per workflow? That's a great question. Not currently, but that is coming. I would imagine that's going to be kind of tied into API support for workflows, because it's kind of the same issue. Oh, hold on. Where did this job go? Workspace forwarding. This might be related to our workflows incident currently, but I can just show you via the config anyway. Right, so currently status badges are just per job, because under the hood, workflows is essentially just stringing together different jobs via our API. Once workflows is integrated first class into our API, I would imagine that things like status badges, notifications, etc., will be able to be used on a per workflow basis. So can you have statuses per tag and per branch? That's a great question. I was actually just wondering about this earlier. I'm not sure, and I will look into that for you. So getting back to this workspaces job, this workflow is doing a really interesting thing where instead of checking out the code in every job, the code is only getting checked out in our first job, which is called bundle dependencies. And then essentially what happens is, let's see, is that right? Okay, never mind. So what I thought was happening maybe was that the entire source repository was being persisted to the workspace, but that's actually not happening here. As you can see, there actually is a checkout step in every job. But this is an example of how kind of modular and configurable workspaces is. Because if you wanted to, instead of checking out from GitHub every time, if you have a small enough repository, you could just persist the entire directory to a workspace and then attach it in subsequent jobs and not have to pull from GitHub again. I'm not sure if it would necessarily be faster or better. Under the hood, persisting to a workspace will just, tar it up into a tar file, send it to S3, and then pull it back down. But it's just another thing to try out. Can you set up a workflow to always run after other workflows, even if a workflow has failed, like in always? That's a great question. That's something folks ask about a lot. We don't have the simple kind of like always key like we do for steps. There are some ways of doing what you're asking about, but the best way to address it would probably be to send over like more information about what specifically you're trying to achieve. And I think we could probably help you figure out a way to do it. Currently, the checkout command is a full clone. Is there any plans to move that to a shallow clone? So we have some infrastructural and architectural reasons for wanting to do a full clone. If you want to do a shallow clone, it's worth noting that you don't have to use our checkout step. You can write your own checkout step if you look in here, you can see exactly what the checkout step is doing, right? So you can just write your own custom logic and put it in a run step and do a shallow clone if you want to do a shallow clone. Because I know lots of folks have asked about that. Yeah, happy to answer that one. So hopefully I've addressed that workspaces question. Yeah, so you're asking if it's best to do it after the checkout step. It really kind of depends on what data you're trying to persist. Like here, we're persisting our Rails vendor bundle directory. So that's a pretty common use of workspaces, is transferring assets and dependencies and things like that. But it's pretty configurable. And I really recommend reading this blog post from last fall, which it talks about the differences between caching, artifacts, and workspaces, and basically all the different ways that you can have data flow between different jobs on CircleCI, because there's a bunch of different ways to do almost everything, which is cool. And let's see if there's any other important stuff to pull out of this. Yeah, so this is a really great kind of summary of these features. So they're all really designed to be really flexible. Our customers are definitely the most creative when it comes to implementing all these features. And you can, if you can think of it, you can probably figure out a way to do it using some combination of workspaces, caching, and artifacts. And yeah, so here's that blog post. I can put a link to that somewhere for folks who want to check it out. So we just have a couple minutes left. So I wanted to talk about this last feature, multiple workflows in a single config. This is something that's really cool, and I don't think it's like officially documented anywhere, but it's a really good example of how modular and controllable Workflows is and what you can do with it. So why would you want to have multiple workflows, and what would that look like? So I can show you some really good examples. So one example is our reality check project. So I'll have to click into a job to view the config. So if you look down here, so the syntax works essentially that, let me finish this question. Under workflows, you can declare your workflow with a name, and then you have a collection of jobs. But as you can see here, you can also have another workflow and then another workflow. It's really up to you. In this case, the multiple workflows is essentially just acting as an organizational tool to group jobs by feature and kind of by what they're doing, which can be really helpful so that when we're looking in our workflows here, you can see that we have our features jobs, our VM jobs, and our resource class jobs. And that's just really nice, simple. You could rerun one workflow, you can rerun another workflow. You don't have to run them all at the same time. But given all of the filtering and control flow features that I've outlined, there are some other reasons that you would also want to do multiple workflows, which I can show you on CircleCI.com here. Hopefully our Workflows UI is, I don't see any status badges, or so it looks like maybe that issue has been resolved. So if we click into, oh, maybe not. Let me see if I can get into one of these jobs. There we go. So this is how we build all of our convenience images that I showed you earlier on hub.docker.com/r/CircleCI. So it's a pretty complex deployment pipeline. To the person who asked about building Docker images, this is a great illustration of how much you can do with CircleCI. So we build all of those Docker images on CircleCI because it's actually faster than building them on Docker Hub. And this is a pretty complex, gnarly workflows config. And I can explain what's going on here and why it's set up this way. We have one workflow that's called build, test, deploy. And this one is triggered on a cron schedule. So that's going to run at midnight UTC every day. And it's only going to run on our production branch. So this is basically just designed to do a nightly build of our images that are ready for production. And it's going to run these set of jobs, right? And if you're curious about what's going on here, this is a use of YAML anchors, which is another great way just to kind of simplify your config and keep your code dry. And we can find the workflow filters up here. So it just allows you to reuse little snippets of config multiple times in your config file instead of having to type it out every time. But you'll see here that we're running these jobs once in this build, test, deploy workflow on a cron schedule. And then here we have our other workflow, which is called commit. So this is going to run on every commit. And we're running mostly the same jobs, but our branches are a little more expansive. So this is going to run essentially the same jobs on more branches, and it's going to run them not on a cron schedule, but on every commit. So there's a couple of really interesting things to pull out here. You can have the same jobs in multiple workflows. This will allow you to run those jobs at different times under different circumstances, which is really helpful for like more complex deployment pipelines. Yeah, so I think that's a pretty great example of why you would want to set up multiple workflows. I know some other customer, for example, a server customer that I've worked with has multiple hosted deployments of CircleCI, you know, set up with different DNS, like a staging installation, a test, like a test installation, and a production installation. And they're using multiple workflows to kind of specify what jobs they want to run on deployments to what installation. So we've got a little under 10 minutes left. That's mostly everything that I wanted to talk about. Happy to answer any other open questions that folks might have. Here's my email address. If you want to follow up with me, I'm happy to answer questions over email as well. And again, our next webinar will be May 31st. We'll be talking about getting started with Docker images and doing Docker builds on CircleCI. So I'll just be hanging out here for the next couple of minutes. If folks have questions, you can just post them in the Q&A. You're welcome.